Retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, a frequent guest here on Rising, was reportedly tapped to serve as Deputy Director of National Intelligence. But within hours of learning that he would be Tulsi Gabbard's #2, the job was yanked down from under his feet. Earlier this month, Jewish Insider published a hit piece on Davis over his criticisms of Israel. A day later, his appointment was abruptly withdrawn.
Editorial Director of Responsible Statecraft and a friend of Davis's, Kelley Vlahos, came to his defense, writing that he is the America First guy the Trump administration needed. She writes in part, quote, "He risked his reputation in 2009, losing out on a typical post-military career in some cushy sinecure, mucking it up with other establishmentarians and planning the next war, or, worse, a board seat at Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman. Instead, he has been tolling away at the truth, and this is how the system rewards him. Shame."
Joining us now to weigh in is Kelley Vlahos. Welcome back to Rising. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
So this is an individual, an expert. We consult on Rising quite frequently on issues, both the Middle East and the Ukraine situation. I know he's a friend of yours, and you work with him, and we will, of course, be happy to have him back on again. But I thought this time we should have on someone who knows him to explain the situation, which I think is deeply unfortunate. And this seems to be some kind of pressure campaign that was aimed at silencing someone who has been, I wouldn't even describe as like extremely or beyond the pale critical of Israel, but merely critical of how much support we are giving and whether that is reflective of where we want American foreign policy to be.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. He, in all of his critiques of U.S. foreign policy, he has been about what is in the best interest of the United States. And to me, that is America first. That is what Trump has campaigned on since 2016. Our war policies, whether they be in Afghanistan, that was 2016, or with the Ukraine war in 2024, are they pursuing America first? And Danny has always argued in that vein, whether it is on Ukraine, Afghanistan, Gaza. And so to smear him, to even suggest anti-Semitism is part of, and we could talk about this, an overall campaign against some of Trump's nominees and appointees who aren't within the mainstream of establishmentarian blob foreign policy and neoconservatism. And so there's been an effort to strike out against these folks, including Danny. And I have to say, this was the easiest column that I have ever written in my life, because when I saw what happened to him, and knowing him the way I do, and as you know, having had him on your show and interviewing him about various national security and foreign policy issues, you know that he's a truth teller, that his positions, his perspective come from a wellspring of experience and deep passion for this country. And so to have that smeared and be smirched in the way that it was just something I had to challenge.
And to that point, Kelley, it's perhaps worth emphasizing for members of our audience who haven't followed every twist and turn of this. The comments that were cited in relation to Israel, it's not as if these were made in secret or they were somehow uncovered. These are things that he has been arguing for very publicly on his own podcast and elsewhere for some time. And in relation to the smearing of them, I mean, it's things like him saying, for example, that the support of Israel during its assault on Gaza is a stain on our character as a nation. One can argue if that's right or wrong, but there are millions and millions of Americans who do believe that to be the case and who are not anti-Semites. So it does seem an oddly unfair attack, at least to my eyes.
Absolutely. I mean, we could go point by point in terms of what Danny's positions are on Israel and Gaza. But when we're talking about a position at the Director of National Intelligence under Tulsi Gabbard, who had fought for that position and was confirmed, we're not talking about somebody who has to be in absolute lockstep with every single position within the Trump administration. You want somebody who is willing to tell the truth, who is willing to engage in all perspectives about a foreign policy issue, approach, strategy, whatever. What we're getting from the Jewish Insider, which wrote the initial smear on Danny, and others. There's also a piece in Tablet magazine that came out over the weekend. Is this idea that because Danny wasn't lockstep, that somehow he would have been a nightmare for this particular position? And these magazines, these writers are saying that Danny's perspective is idiosyncratic with the Trump administration, that it is far outside the mainstream. Now, I will argue that it is not. But even if he did have different perspectives, isn't that what you want in an intelligence role? Is you'd have different and competing, not just perspectives, but just views on some of these issues, particularly as fraught as Israel-Gaza, as Ukraine, as what's going on in Latin America and the Middle East. And so this idea that that the Trump administration must only have loyal soldiers and people who only think in a monolith is an anathema to what I would say would be a healthy foreign policy and national security approach. And that's not what these magazines are suggesting. They're suggesting that everybody has to think the same about everything.
Exactly, and let's be clear about how this happened, right? He was obviously, the Trump administration, it seemed, I don't know exactly how this process of selecting him worked, but it seemed like that they were happy to have him, perhaps for exactly that reason. I agree with you that a team of rivals style politics that incorporates different perspectives is very healthy. Then what clearly happened is people who want a universally across the board pro-Israel foreign policy at any cost. And and I say that as someone who has been very supportive of Israel on this show, but has questions about what level of support is actually in the best interest of America and the American people. That's a question that millions of Americans have on both sides of the political spectrum. Republicans have these questions, Democrats have these questions. Anyway, his nomination gets tanked by Jewish Insider speaking up, by Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat, calling him utterly unqualified for this position. I wonder if Democrats have not apparently gotten the message at all that their own base is frustrated about how they have handled the Gaza issue and still want to, be seen as being as maximally pro unrestricted military action by Israel in Gaza as possible. And so that's what makes him unqualified, is thinking that maybe there should be an end to this violence and destruction. Maybe the American need to support it is at some point exhausted. That is the view that is beyond the pale. It's really awful that that's the case.
Yeah, and I mean, and as I suggested earlier, that this was part of a broader campaign against many of Trump's nominees and appointees. So in those articles that I mentioned, the Jewish Insider and Tablet and a few others that have been sharing them on Twitter, they bring up Mike Domino, who is in the DOD under Hegseth. They bring up Elbridge Colby. They bring up Dan Caldwell. Well, what do all these guys have in common? They're from the realist and restrainer wing of the conservative base. They're an up-and-coming group of foreign policy analysts who are very America first, but have been critical of our policies in Ukraine and Middle East and in other places, and that they have spread our forces too thin, that they have engaged us, the United States, in regime change wars that have actually backlashed and boomeranged against us. They have been critical of the lack of a defense industrial policy here, and the fact that we've been giving billions of dollars away to Ukraine and Israel and other places without minding our own stores. And so those people have been under attack because they have been a challenge to the foreign policy establishment of the last 30 years, the post-Cold War approach. And they are these folks inside the White House who don't agree are running scared. And so what they have is they've used the Israel policy, which has, we know that just talking about Israel is a third rail in this town. And by smearing them and suggesting that they are anti-Semitic or they are weak, we haven't even talked about Iran. That's another area in which they've used, they've used a smear against these folks because they haven't been willing to go full throttle into a war with Iran and have vocalized that. And that's also been used against them. And so, yeah, they've been trying to find new ways to pursue foreign policy, more diplomatic, God forbid. And this is what happens. And unfortunately, Danny, like you mentioned, has been very open about his positions. And so they were able to use that against him. And I guess there just wasn't enough support for him inside the DNI. And unfortunately, we have one less truth teller inside the administration today.
It is frustrating because, as you point out, it is not a fringe position. It is a position held by millions and millions of Americans that we need to be America first and be more selective about exercising our own military power elsewhere in the world. Kelley Vlahos, thank you so much for coming on to discuss all this. We really appreciate it.